Welcome to the Oh So Spurs podcast. It's been reported Spurs have no cash to buy players. Well, we're going to dive into the facts. Do Spurs have cash? How much do they have? And what's the difference between cash and all these financial regulations we have to follow, like PSR and FFP? And to help me with it all is the wonderful Nick, who works in corporate finance. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing well, Jim. So this is all about cash. So how much cash does Tottenham have? How much does it make? And you came up with a really good point there about how is it different from profit and sustainability rules. I think the main thing to remember that we hear some great headlines. The great headline is that Tottenham have headroom of maybe 200 million, 250 million. So immediately, we always believe, well, that's how much we can spend. I think it's important to stress, though, that even though profit and sustainability rules permit, say, spend up to 200 million, all clubs are dependent on real cash availability, not just that regulatory headroom. We've used in the past on some of our previous pods, Jim, about the example of a credit card. So if you take me, for example, I have a credit card company that really wants me to spend money and they might give me a limit of £20,000. Now, I can spend up to £20,000 quite happily without them batting an eyelid or being too worried about me, as long as I'm making some minimum payments. That does not mean, though, that I have £20,000 in my account to cover that. And that's exactly the way that cash and PSR works for football clubs. So transfers can be viewed in multiple ways. So let's just take a player Rex at Club Y is worth £50 million and Tottenham want to go and buy that player for 50 million. So that total transfer amount is 50 million. Then the amortised amount, which we've spoken about previously, is where we spread that cost over the life of the contract, typically 5 years. So that 50 million player actually costs 10 million a year for 5 years. And then the third one, which is probably the more interesting one that we haven't spoken about previously, is the payment scheduled. So typically that 50 million might be split into, say, 3 payments. You have 33% as an upfront fee that the selling club gets, then 33% might be paid in year 1, 33% paid in year 2. So you've got like 3 different views there. There's the top level number of 50 million that Tottenham have to pay for this player. Then you've got, when it hits the balance sheet, you've got the amortised amount, which is 50 million spread over 5 years. And then you've got the payment schedule. So this is the real term cash that a club will have to spend each year to buy that player.
So you could kind of, if you put it into a real world context, back to the start point on that credit card example, the difference between PSR and how much money you have. I was thinking about another way we can represent this is, yes, it's a bit like saying you've been approved for a 20 grand credit limit because you're based on your income and all these things. They believe that's a safe amount for you. But what they can't see is that you've also might have just signed up to a lot of other things or just bought yourself a new convertible car and spent all your cash in the bank and no longer be in a sustainable position to spend all that and pay it back. So just because you've got the credit limit doesn't mean you should necessarily go and use it all, because you should know your own cash flow to know whether you can actually afford to do that or not. And if Spurs went and spent £292 million, which is their PSR headroom right now, they probably wouldn't be able to pay that back without having to seek external measures to try and help them. So it'd be a very risky thing to do. And yeah, like with buying players, there's different process, right? You almost put your deposit down and then you kind of have installments which you're paying for that player. But the way you record it on a balance sheet, you'll average out the value of that over a year or over 5 years, say, to put it into your finances for your accountant, as an example, which would be kind of amortization.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I know I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we don't know this, but I wouldn't be surprised if in some of the negotiations with those players, the selling club will put a slight premium depending on the terms and the structure of what we want to make, of how we want to make those payments. So when we hear a lot of really good journalists, when they talk about that a deal between a club and a player is really close, but there's just some finer details required around the structure of the payments. This is often what they mean. And this is why it's so important to the club that's purchasing it, this player. If they're having a huge outlay on the transfer fee of this player, they need to make sure that they phase those payments right and it stacks up with all of the other commitments that they've got. For example, the personal example you gave, Jim, like the new car that they've bought or the new obligation they have on something else that they've bought. This is almost like a bit of a finance term of something called net present value. And I won't go too deep into this, but net present value is basically the concept that money today is worth slightly more than what it may be in future. So, for example, Jim, if you were to lend me £100 because it's close to payday, I haven't quite got enough to go up to Tottenham this week, and I say, Jim, I'm in a bit of a tight spot. Can you lend me £100? You might say, yeah, Nick, no worries. And I say, don't worry, I'm going to pay you back at the end of the week. To you, that's probably no big deal. You think, that's all right. I'm 5 to 7 days without £100. I'm going to be okay. But what if I was to say, well, actually, Jim, I'm going to pay you back, but I'm going to pay you back over the next 6 months in instalments? You might think to yourself, well, hang on a second. I could utilize that money right now and I could do something with it. I could invest with it. I could spend it on something that I really want. So the value of that £100 to you right now is worth more than what it is in instalments in 6 months' time.
Yeah, I actually had this in real life. Just before the COVID period, for reasons I won't share on here, I lent some money to someone, and I came to a point with COVID hit out of everywhere. Interest rates start flying up, all these things. I start to think, wow, that cash would be handy right now. There's so much I could have used that for. Anyway, it was for a bigger picture. It was more important not to ask for that back at that time. Transfer fees still owed, and the kind of situations Spurs find themselves in at the moment. Then Nick, kind of, I think a lot of people want to know, like, how healthy are we? Because these reports, I think what sparked this is Matt Law, really well-established journalist. I know some people will say he doesn't like Spurs, blah, blah, blah. But aside from that, he gets most of his reporting pretty well right, clearly his connection with the club. And he's reported that our cash levels, I think he said, are dangerously low. But there's context, right? Because you did the numbers before and you said, look, we've got £292 million in PSR headroom. As we said, our credit limit effectively. But we have then, you can't just use all of that. As we say, it's different to cash flow. Then you look at our cash flow, we turn over £629 million, made £23 million from selling players, but we had a lot of costs and we also owe a lot of money for players coming. So how much do we have left at the end of this? If you figured all that out?
Yeah, I mean, look, you've summed it up perfectly, Jim. So, I mean, I'd love it if Matt Law's saying that our cash levels are dangerously low. It's a fantastic headline. I mean, what's Matt Law done? Has he got a copy of Tottenham's bank statement? Did he log on to their online banking and have a look and say, oh yeah, that actually looks dangerously low. I'm worried about that. The reality is Matt Law doesn't know. What he will have done, though, is he probably has a reference point in time, which is our 2024 accounts, which was recently published. So let's take those because that's a factual statement. So I would just say as well, like to the guys that listen in to your pod, by all means, go and have a look at the Tottenham accounts. They're free to view on Companies House. I've looked through them all quite a few times. So if you think about the transfer fees owed at the moment, so we've gone through 2 seasons where we've invested very heavily in the squad. So you would imagine that their amortization bill is going to increase, which it has done. But you're also going to see the amount of transfer fees owed is going to increase. So there's some great headlines out there as well about Tottenham owe, 300 million or something like that outstanding on transfer fees. While on the high side, I wouldn't say that it's that unusual on the basis of where we are today in terms of signing lots of new players and turning over the squad, and B, in terms of what other clubs are doing. I mean, if we just use, say, Arsenal as a benchmark, Arsenal around 268 million, we're at just over 300 million. So it's fairly negligible. What those accounts did say, Spurs accounts, is that we had to pay 146 million, or 146 million pound was due in transfer fees, installments to clubs over the previous financial year. So we're talking the last season 24 to 25. And this isn't an amortized figure. This is pure cash the club are going to have to pay out. So, sounds worrying. Go on, Jim, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, I think for listeners, it's important. This is something that you explained to me in the past. The amortization thing, and just to recap on that, and the difference between that and how much money you actually owe for players can be really confusing. Because as we said, like, people go, amortization, isn't that when, we've all heard the rules of FFP, Chelsea sign a player for £100 million, give him a 10-year contract, and then just can record it as 10 million, 10 million, 10 million, 10 million for 10 years. And then the rules changed to make it as 5 years as a maximum you could do that, to kind of make it hard for clubs to hide it. So as an example, if you sign a £50 million player, it would be £10 million a year. For 5 years, you record that as not as a £50 million spend against your, FFP and PSR limits you have. But all that is a way of showing things on a balance sheet. It's not actually accurately reflecting when you owe that money. Because you don't actually owe £10 million a year for 5 years to Liverpool if that's who you bought a player off. You might have owed them 50 million quid up front, but you record it on your balance sheet as £10 million every year. So it's not actually an accurate reflection of how much money you have or owe in that small context of your club's finances. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that difference between that as amortization versus the money you actually owe, which you're talking about now for players.
Yeah.
The real money you actually know is is something different, and that's what we're talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on, Jim. That's it. That's exactly what it is. This 146 million is not an amortized amount. It's real money that has to change hands and has to be paid. Now, that 146 million definitely got paid. Why? Because there's nothing in the news that says that Tottenham have reneged on any transfer deals. So Tottenham will have had to have paid that. They've paid out 146 million. Now, I would, and I mean, as I said, guys, if anybody's interested, it's page 37 on our most recent accounts under current liabilities. So I'd encourage everyone, if they haven't had a look, please do have a look. And if there's anything interesting you find, then do give us a shout. What I would say, though, as well, is that figure, 146 million, that doesn't just go away. That's been topped up in terms of the last transfer window of players that we bought. So there is still going to be amounts owed in the next 1 to 2 to 3 years. So, okay, 146 million, think, oh my God, that sounds like our whole transfer budget. What are we going to do? What I would also say as well is that there is some good news in the sense that we were due to receive and probably have received about 58 million in transfer fees as well. So that's obviously the players that we sold in the previous window. It may be players like, it may be instalments for, say, Harry Kane or Harry Winks or Davinson Sanchez, those types of players. And obviously last season, or in the current season, we had a slightly better record at selling players as well. So if you think about Oliver Skipp, so while for example, some of the youth team players, so while the absolute transfer fees may not be so high, I would say the good news is from a cash flow basis, we're going to continue to see some of those instalments come into our accounts over the next few years.
And this is why it's important to make sure we're selling players at the right time. It's a balance, isn't it, of not hampering your squad and always selling at the peak value, because peak value typically equals peak performance, and that's why they're worth so much. And you want peak performance in your team. But we've all played Football Manager, probably listening to this. We all have the same transfer tactic when we play it. We buy all the wonder kids and we come in and we do the heartless thing and we sell Son Heung-min at the first opportunity because he's 30 years old. And we use that to buy 5 wonder kids, knowing that if we bide our time, we will go on to dominate. And you've got to kind of get in real life a middle ground to that, where you're not clinging on to sentimental value of players, because unfortunately, whether you like it or not, they are assets. And in a world that football is becoming more and more business orientated, more about the race of who can have the most revenue so they can spend the most money, you've got to leverage those assets to get in an advantageous position there and underpin it with a world-class recruitment strategy so you're not wasting your money, which I think judging by our inability to get an ROI on players when we go to sell them, implies we haven't got it right in recent years because we're struggling to sell the assets we bought, which implies they've depreciated in value because they haven't met expectations for us, especially when it's them in their peak years and we still can't get rid of them. So on the other topics as well, we wanted to talk a bit about how we can generate more cash, right, Nick?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, look, there are some, there are positives for us. What I would say is the first thing around, let's talk about cash in the bank. So cash in the bank in 2024, 79 million. So that has reduced significantly by, nearly 100 million on the previous year. So people might say, well, where's that money gone? Well, it's no surprise we've been significantly investing in our squad. And there's been a lot of that revenue will have gone into the structure of those payments, as we've just covered. 79 million actually, in the grand scheme of things, is pretty healthy when compared to lots of other clubs. I think it's the second highest cash in the bank at the moment of all the Premier League clubs. So if we're worried about our cash reserves being dangerously low, there's many other clubs that have got significantly lower levels of cash than what Tottenham does. And so that's the first thing. The other thing is, and this is pure speculation, but it's worth touching on, is that there have been comments around maybe that there are certain covenants with the stadium finances or debt that we have to hold a certain amount of cash in the bank. What I would say to that is that there is no evidence of that whatsoever. We don't know if there is any mandating of cash reserves for the debenture that we have. And so I wouldn't pay much attention to that. But on its own, it's fairly positive. On its own, it's fairly positive that we have that cash. But what I think it does show is that will only serve as really kind of a short-term to support short-term transfer activity. There does need to be sort of additional cash that comes into the club in the future. The positive thing is, though, is that I think this is where Tottenham actually do really well in terms of their accounts. So the P&L's very healthy. We're good at making income, predominantly from football operations, but we also boost it as well from the events that we have at the stadium, which delivers a really good amount of commercial revenue that lots of other clubs will not see. So I don't know if that answered your question, Jim. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole there of how much we had in our account, but
it does. It's interesting because, Robbie, what the figure did we come to last time? It was around 32 million, was it? We reckon we had? roughly?
For 32 million for
Cash.
transfers, or
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Go on, sorry.
it's look, honestly, Jim, it's so hard to know because we see all of this at a point in time.
Yeah.
And none of us can know unless we actually are looking at Tottenham's accounts right now. What I will say is, I mean, if we looked forward to 2025, because we're looking back in time,
Yeah.
and one of the things that I always say in finance is that an account statement is just a statement of the past. It does not predict the future. If we wanted to predict what we might be able to do in 2025, we'll just give I'll give some headline figures. So match receipts, we believe, will be up by about 20 million as a result of our success in the Europa League. Our TV and media, like our prize money from the Premier League, is broadly speaking going to be down somewhat because instead of finishing fifth, we finished 17th. And
Mm.
for every place we fall below fifth, it's worth roughly about 2.8 million. So that might end up costing us around about 30 million. However, UEFA prize money, we know we got a bump from that. That's gonna net off almost like the shortfall there. And overall, I would expect sponsorship to go up. As a result of being in the Champions League, we'll have other commercial revenue from lots of concerts that we have. And so I'd expect still, generally speaking, like you say, about 30 million. I'd say anywhere a range between about 25 to 40 million extra we're going to have this year that we had on top of last year to invest in players.
Interesting. Well, what we're going to do as well in a future episode is look at if we were spending like we are now, how much would we have if we'd stayed at the old White Hart Lane and didn't have all these Beyonce concerts, everything else? The initial back off fag packet numbers show that we wouldn't have any cash if we'd, and it's not a real world because you wouldn't have spent what we'd spent, right? And all these other variables. But I think it's important to remember and look back at when you look at the past and the future with numbers. Sometimes decisions can be frustrating. We are in a much more powerful position because of these extra incomes we've had. Every game we generate so much more money than we ever could have because of this extra capacity. How much more is a game worth in the Europa League now to us than it would be to a Bournemouth with a 12,000 seater stadium? It's why we've built the model we've built as Spurs and why we need that European football, because to us 10 plus extra games a season could be another football player that we can afford. And I would say even if even say there was only £30 million in the bank, like we say, how we structure these deals doesn't hamstring Tottenham to a point where they can't go and buy someone, because the way that we typically pay for players would be a deposit of just say £10 million, and then it might be £50 million in instalments over the next 3 years. So you could still technically buy three £50 million players if the other club's happy with that structure, which they often are, or even obligations to buy where you pay nothing up front. And you just say, look, if you let me have this £50 million player on an obligation to buy nothing up front this year, I'll give you 55 million next year. Some clubs are happy with that model as well, right? So I think it's a misleading title to say Spurs are broke, effectively, is kind of what it was trying to kind of say.
I agree, and I think you've come on nicely into like how can Tottenham make more cash, because we've already spoken about what may be coming, but there are other opportunities. So I mean, just as a first instance, I mean, we can talk about how owners can inject cash into a club. So what we know is that ENIC have undertaken a capital injection from a shares issue. And look, in my personal opinion, this is the best way to get capital into a club because it means that the club are not reliant on an owner for any kind of either whether it be an interest-free loan or a shareholder type loan, because at some point that will have to be paid back to the club or it will be wrapped up in terms of when that club is bought out. So that's still an option. And ENIC injected at least, I think, 150 million into the club. And the best thing about that has no adverse impact on PSR headroom either. The other things that we could look at, so next season we've got Champions League. Going further, it can't be underestimated just how much money, additional revenue that Champions League can give us. The further we go, the more money we will have to invest in the squad. The money that we would get from Champions League pretty much dwarfs any single other competition that's available, either European or domestic. So it's definitely worth focusing on that purely from a cash injection perspective. But look, I'm a romantic like you. I mean, I was in Bilbao watching the final in the stadium. I absolutely loved it. Huge bucket list thing for me. So it's almost quite contradictory for somebody like me that enjoyed that day so much to say, just focus on Champions League, don't worry about domestic trophies. But if we're taking it back to just a pure financial outcome, getting to the quarterfinal or the semi-final of the Champions League is far better for us than, say, winning the League Cup or the FA Cup. Just in financial terms, not as the fan experience, I'd much prefer the latter. But you can understand that this is the challenge that lots of the people within the club and the fans will have. And that revenue from Champions League can be invested in the team, gives you a platform for more sustainable growth.
Yeah. And well, the thing is as well, people will argue that the more money you have, the more chance you have of those glory days. So by being in the top four and being in the Champions League, you increase your chances of winning a League Cup or an FA Cup. It's not quite as simple as one's more important than the other. It's
Exactly.
a complicated story depending on where you are.
And it's a great debate, and it's a perfect debate for fans to have, because there is no right or wrong about it. You can just put down, these are the realities, the fiscal realities that club owners, not just ENIC, but all clubs are having to deal with. I mean, and the other one, though, that we mentioned, like, how can we get more cash? And I actually think this is something that we are going to see. The obvious one, and you've already mentioned it, Jim, is player sales. So we have a squad that isn't balanced. At present, it doesn't comply with UEFA's 25-man squad rules in terms of foreign registered players. We currently have 19 foreign registered players, and there's a maximum headroom of 17. So 2 would have to be left out if we don't sell anyone. If we want to bring anybody in, we'd have to either A, leave more out, or B, move more on. The thing with that, though, is that allows us to turn over the squad a little bit, freshen it up, and it will bring in more cash into the club as well that we can use as a combination to invest in new players and also to repay our remaining commitments. But again, I mean, who we sell is like an amazing debate. You want to go down that ruthless route of saying, right, actually, Son, you're a club legend. Thanks very much. You're 32, 33 now. That's the end of it. Or do you say, no, actually, we'll keep focusing on some of the fringe players? And again, no right or wrong answer about that. That's, why we exist as fans, that we can debate these things and have really good discussions about it.
Yeah. Well, it is very interesting. I just want that, because with kind of a numbers focused playlist, it's not all money. I want to say there's a good way to remember the squad limits that you mentioned earlier, because a lot of people find that really confusing, like club grown, homegrown, non-homegrown. Well, you imagine it like a formation, 17-4-4. You can have 17 non-homegrown, 4 homegrown, and 4 club trained. I quite like that, looking at it as kind of like a football formation. So 17-4-4 is the rule. We've got 18 in the 17 spot, so that bit's full. We've got too many fake, I guess, goalkeepers would be in that position. Anyway, you know what I mean. But thanks so much, Nick, for joining again, and looking forward to the next finance piece. I think we're going to do how many Beyoncés to buy Solanke, I think was one of the topics, and how are Spurs funding their hotels were the 2 kind of topics we're going to cover next. So make sure you subscribe for that.
Look forward to those, Jim.
And and thanks, shout out to Rostin for sending in that squad rule thing. Anyway, up the Spurs.
Up the Spurs.
You sick podcasts and football shows that are just a bunch of people spouting opinions with no substance. It's always toxic negativity. It's toxic positivity. There's no substance. You don't come out of it feeling like you've learned anything new. Well, that's why we created Oh So Spurs. It's the Thinking Fans podcast. I'm Jim, and I'm the host. But I am only a sum of many brilliant parts. We have A-licensed coaches like JJ to help us dissect how games changed and how coaches are adapting. We have people who work in finance to tell us how much can Spurs actually spend and why we don't leave it all down to opinions when we discuss these things. We always look for the facts. We go and search long and hard to find people who've actually worked at Spurs. We talk to ex-coaches from Tottenham. We talk to ex-coaches from players we've recently signed to get you a deeper level look into them than you're going to get on a typical show on the internet. But we depend on our members to get this kind of content. To raise the bar and provide you with higher quality content, we need to find a revenue stream that is sustainable for us. And that is where you come in as members. You are the lifeblood of our show. We all do this for free as members of the show, and we need the money to survive and keep it running. So if you would like to be a member, we will promise you back an extra 2 videos per week as a minimum, and first access to our daily videos that come out as well, alongside other things like access to our WhatsApp groups, where you will find those 8 licensed coaches and those finance experts and the rest of the panel to have a chat to about Spurs. So welcome to the show, and I hope you get all you're looking for and you like to stick around. Up the Spurs.